Hello, everyone. I'm Marta Sancodi, Technology Programs Director and Smart Buildings Program Manager at the Telecommunications Industry Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar, Assessing Smart Buildings Intelligence to Deliver Optimized Operations and Improved Occupant Experience. Before we start, I'd like to cover a few administrative items. The webinar is scheduled to run for 1 hour. We plan to answer questions at the end, but you can submit questions at any time using the Questions tab on your screen. Audio is available only through your computer. Occasionally, participants have trouble with the audio coming through clearly. If that happens to you, please log out of BrightTalk and then log back in, as that usually fixes the problem. The recorded version is always fine, and you will be able to listen to the program on demand starting later today. Conference participants will receive 1 Bixby Continuing Education credit. The email to request the credit is posted on this slide and also on the last slide. Be aware that it can take several days to process the credit request. Finally, the continuing education credits are also available to those who watch the webinar on demand with the added requirement to pass a short quiz. Please note, any products identified or identifiable via a trade name or otherwise in this presentation as products supplied by particular suppliers is provided for the convenience of users of this presentation and does not constitute an endorsement of any kind by TIA of the product's name. This information may be provided as an example of suitable products available commercially. Equivalent products may be used if they can be shown to lead to the same results. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dave Stalin, TIA CEO. Dave, please take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Marta, and welcome everybody to this first webinar in our series on smart buildings. This is an extremely important subject. While I've only been with TIA for approximately 6 months, I've been in our ICT industry for about 35 years and have seen many technological changes, copper to fiber, analog to digital, wireline to wireless, proprietary to open source. And what we're experiencing now could be the biggest change yet. TIA has been serving our industry for about 80 years, and perhaps there's no more important time than the present. Our world is more connected now than ever. Our reliance on communications to connect us is paramount to our success. TIA supports our members by bringing together communities of interest to solve critical and strategic issues. We create standards, more than 3,000 in our history. We help enable new technologies. For example, 5G rollouts need compute at the edge, and we're developing an edge data center standard. We solve overarching issues, such as supply chain security, through the creation of a new program to ensure verifiable transparency into our ICT supply chain. And we advocate for our industry to help shape U.S. and global regulatory policy. This Smart Buildings program actually encompasses all the points that I just mentioned. A special thanks to our founding sponsors, Corning and T-Mobile, for their recognition that smart buildings will be critical to the future of our industry. Their foresight is extremely valuable. The time is right for a holistic approach to smart buildings. Our globe's population is becoming increasingly urbanized. It's expected that within about 30 years, an additional 2.5 billion people will live in urban areas, approximately 2/3 of the world's population, making buildings even more important to our overall success. This also creates significant opportunity for building owners, for operators, designers, and those providing the underlying systems and connectivity for these buildings, both within the buildings and to the buildings. New technology enables us to connect these previously disparate IT and OT systems. Opportunities, yes, lower operating expenses, better occupancy satisfaction, much higher returns for the building owners. But we will also need to overcome the risks, for example, safety and security. TIA and our Smart Buildings Working Group participants are developing a set of criteria that looks at smart buildings holistically. Let me back up here. There it is. Some had previously considered individual components such as energy consumption, but none have looked at the entire building and its relationship to the occupants. Doing so will give us a true and complete perspective on the intelligence of the building. The 6 categories we are developing to create this overall criteria include connectivity, health and well-being, life and property safety, power and energy, cybersecurity, and sustainability. This webinar on assessing smart building intelligence will be followed by another one in June on in-building connectivity. I'm having some issues here. And then we'll follow that with 2 more webinars at least later on this year. Again, a very special thank you to our Smart Building Program founding sponsors, T-Mobile and Corning, who had the foresight to understand the importance of this subject. Thank you, and let me turn it over to Marta again.
Thank you, Dave. I would like to welcome today's webinar panelists. Brian, Sala, and Luke, please introduce yourselves.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Davis. I'm with Corning. I've got responsibility for market development for in-building networks, and say that we spend most of our time focusing on networking trends, how we use networks, and ensuring we're considering the right network architectures, both wired and wireless, to deliver on the current and future needs within buildings. I appreciate everyone's attention and being here today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sala Palos from Microsoft. I'm a director in our Center of Innovation for our Global Real Estate and Security organization, and that is an internal role for driving forward the digital building lifecycle that includes the building information model-based design and engineering, digital construction, and then digital twins in owner operations on a larger scale. In addition to my internal role, I'm also the new global lead for our worldwide construction community and bridging the industry with our own teams developing new technology solutions for the market. Thank you.
And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Lucas. I'm the Senior Manager for Engineering Business Development at T-Mobile, and I'm the only person that holds that title. In my role, I focus on 5G smart and in-building coverage. 5 years ago, I conceived a program today that is represented in the marketplace called Build Your Own Coverage, or BYOC. The goal there is really to get enterprise to focus on delivering in-building coverage and connectivity to every single person that comes through their door. And it's not carrier specific, it's not carrier exclusive, but we are driving that message. We are partnering with TIA and others like Microsoft and Corning on this call and other strategic partners in the marketplace to drive the focus of what I believe is the fifth utility or utility-like service. Today, like no other, it is now time to have wireless connectivity wherever we go, whenever we need it. So the goal today in the partnership with TIA is to encourage that coaching and guidance, give you some roadmap planning that you can take back to your offices, share with your constituents, share with your partners, share with your staff to grow and foster a wireless master plan. So I appreciate joining today, and it's an honor to be with Sala and with Brian on the panel.
Thank you, Brian, Sala, and Luke. Let's now open the discussion with this first question. What are some of the technology challenges faced by developers of smart buildings? Sala, I would like to ask you to be the first one to answer this question.
Thank you, Marta. I would say that the approach here should be the people, business, and technology approach, and how we might cater to the needs of people as decision makers and end users of the physical buildings that are the smart environments. And the challenge is that a lot of times real estate owners do not know who the tenants are going to be. So they have to focus on the technical total performance of the building rather than the social performance of the building. And that way, if we are thinking about that approach, the digital environment that makes the environment smart becomes the tie between the physical and the social environment.
Thank you, Sala. Brian, your turn, please.
Sure. I think that when we consider the technology, the biggest consideration is simply that technology is a new consideration, and it needs to be a much more important consideration than what it has been in the past. I mean, historically, all the technology decisions in a building have been an afterthought, or at best considered much later in the design cycle of a building. So the key is that planning technology on the front end can not only ensure that owners hit the mark for the requirements, but by considering next generation network architectures, the results can also include cost savings, space savings, and energy savings. So there's both a responsibility and an advantage with how technology is considered.
Thank you, Brian. And Luke, please add your point of view.
Thanks, Marta. I think it's challenging. It's complicated. If it was simplistic, like simply calling a plumber or calling an electrician, calling a locksmith, I think more people would adapt to the technology in their building. But it requires, as Brian said, as Sala indicated, it requires planning. It requires creating a plan, and it requires each and every property operator, and that's how we term it at T-Mobile. If you're operating the property, and that could be a tenant, it could be a developer, it could be a property manager, you need to create a master plan for wireless, just like every other plan that you have for your real estate, whether that's a safety plan, electric plan. Wireless plan is now an essential component. And last but not least, you need to involve some strategic partners, people that you know, people that you'll get to know, people that you will trust. And whether that's one strategic partner or many, that is your consortium, that is your team, and that's the team that will build your wireless plan. Last but not least, I think there is a risk for people to finance wireless technology, and I think we'll touch on that as we get further into the webinar this morning. Marta?
Thank you, Luke. Why is connectivity often compared to a traditional utility and referred to as the fourth utility? Brian, let's start with you on this one.
Sure, Marta. It's a great question, and I think that whether we look at it as the fourth or the fifth utility, the operative word here is utility. And when we walk into a building, we expect utilities to be there. And so, for example, when I walk up to a sink and turn a handle, I expect water to come out. And if it doesn't, that's a bit of a problem, right? So it's the same with my devices. I walk into a building, I pull out my phone, and I expect to see Wi-Fi or cellular, or preferably both. And if I don't have a connection, that's a problem. And so that's why we think about it in the context of being as important and with the same expectation as utilities. I mean, connectivity it's an absolute must because we depend upon networks for so much more than what we have in the past.
Interesting. Thank you, Brian. Luke, what would you add to that?
Well, honestly, I thought I was going to get into a controversial discussion with Brian this morning. between the fourth and fifth utility, but you can see that we actually are aligned very well. And the expectation, to coattail on Brian's comments this morning, is that we all know every single person in our lives and in our extended lives carries at least one device today. So it still resonates with me that there's a difficulty of getting wireless technology incorporated into real estate. So this is how we present it within the industry. We try to make sure that people understand that if it's considered a utility or utility-like service, as Brian said, it's an expected deliverable. And so you're letting your tenants down, you're letting your visitors down, you're letting your guests, your investors, anybody who comes onto the real estate, you're letting them down by not having robust connectivity. And connectivity in the T-Mobile life is every amount of spectrum that's available today. So if that's Wi-Fi, but truly, obviously, we believe that the ultimate experience is the cellular component. So it's blending those and synthesizing those to make sure that they're available on all real estate, to make sure that we're meeting all the expectations of our tenants and our users and our visitors. So Marta, back to you.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
before we go back to Marta, if I could tack on to that a little bit, because I think it's, Luke's making a very important point about letting the tenants down or letting guests. So we think about having connectivity in a building, then the fact that we've got in any given building multiple people walking in with multiple types of devices, and the point is that regardless of whether it's an employee or a vendor or guest as a customer, whomever's walking into that building with whatever device they have, that they are able to connect and do their jobs and to do what they need to do with the networks, again, because it's that dependability that we have upon networks and needing to run our businesses and stay connected and so on and so forth. So having that ability of someone to walk in, it is a marketability aspect that we'll get into a little bit later of the building, and that's so true, that part too, but then there is the absolute, that reliability of what you need to have in a connection and not letting the tenants and the guests as they come into the building down by not being able to have that connection.
Sala, what is your perspective on this?
Thank you, Marta. My perspective here is, again, the people and how different companies have already been able to attract the talent that they want to retain as their workforce. But it's also about attracting the future talent. And if we don't have the support of agile network, cellular, Wi-Fi connectivity to enable people to access data that they need for confident decision making and making the teams connected, as a lot of people work with remote teams, etc. That is kind of impairing the building itself, that people who are arriving into the building to have it as a strategic workplace or a place to perform, they can't do it if there is no connectivity to the outside world and to the people that they are working with. So overall, having strong connections enable people to access data and information, intelligence, and refine that into the knowledge that they can then apply for what they are doing, either digitally or either physically in the building that they have arrived into.
Thank you, Sala. And let's move on. What decisions do stakeholders need to make to implement a comprehensive and sustainable smart building? And Sala, I'd like to ask you to continue with you answering this question.
Oh, thank you, Marta. And I would tie this into the real estate owners or investors' investment strategy and how that derives the design strategy that they are asking the architects and engineers and contractors to follow. And once the real estate owner comprehends that when they are investing into the total performance of their smart environments, they are planning ahead their total cost of ownership. And that way they can look at the short-term and the long-term investment and really understand and comprehend early on that when they are making choices about what goes into the building, what is integrated into the physical environment, they are already cost engineering that when the building is only in its digital format. And when they continue on and start to choose suppliers, that's when they value engineer what is the added value of different suppliers' systems, and we are no longer looking at removing the smart components from the physical environment, but we are looking at adding more. And that way, the mindset of the real estate owner is no longer focusing on the cost, but they are actually thinking about the value and the worth that they're getting from the smart environment.
Thank you, Sala. I'd like to ask Brian if you can please continue answering.
Yeah, sure. I'll tack on to what Sala's saying, and from a planning perspective, I think that's very, very important. But to take it one step further, and not only planning kind of the future state of the networks, but that planning for network requirements has to consider how we are going to use and access networks, and really how we are already using and access networks differently today than just a few years ago. I mean, we look more about a workplace that's more untethered and more of a mobile environment. And so we shifted our connection point from, one user at a given desktop to multiple users to an aggregation point up in the ceiling. And so at this aggregation point, there's going to be a higher demand for both bandwidth and power, but this also represents the opportunity to combine multiple networks at that single point, and thus eliminating multiple layers of infrastructure and be able to replace multiple category runs by taking fiber all the way to the edge of the network. And so when the design or the network design is considered like this from the start, again, that planning aspect on the front end of the building design, the benefits of some of these front-end CapEx savings of less cable, smaller cable trays, reduction of telecommunications closet, those type savings become very real. And then we're able to add in and see on day two savings of using less energy and better utilization of the network electronics. And then, I mean, you throw in the aesthetic benefit of now I've got less infrastructure that I actually have to hide throughout the building. So as we see more and more opportunities for convergence in the network, and how we can solve for today's and tomorrow's bandwidth requirements with an all-fiber infrastructure, I mean, we start to see the benefit of planning and designing the network differently. But this does drive choices that need to be made earlier in the design process. So this has to be incorporated early on. It can't be the old adage of, we'll figure that out later when the building's almost done. There are advantages that can be gained by putting this type of planning into the building design much, much earlier, right from the start.
Thank you, Brian. And Luke, your turn, please.
Thanks, Marta. To continue the discussion with Sala and Brian, I think we as panelists all agree that planning is the most important aspect to your real estate. You have to properly plan. You can't be disruptive to the tenants because that's disruptive to your income. And when the tenants are disrupted, they start looking elsewhere for alternatives, and that alternative real estate might not be yours. So what I think all three of us foster is the fact that there are three key pillars of planning. When you're building or remodeling a property, or if you're a governmental agency that approves remodeling or building of a property, there has to be a checklist that involves these four items. First, you have to absolutely add as much conduit as humanly possible. That conduit with pull strings will provide future provisioning that will allow you to do whatever technology, whatever G, whatever electronics is presented to make your building robust with connectivity. Second, pull as much Ethernet as humanly possible. Again, adding more to the component than what your architect or builder may call out. add as much as you can. Along the same lines of Ethernet is fiber. Pull as much fiber as humanly possible. And last but not least, when you take a look at the specs on your remodel or your new construction, or if you're a governmental agency giving that approval, make sure that the property is upsized on its power requirements. These four components, conduit, Ethernet, fiber, and power, will provision you for your roadmap for any G going forward. As we progress from 4G, incorporating 4G with 5G as a data component, and as we'll move into 6G in 10 years of time, you want to be prepared. These four pillars will do just that. Marta?
Thank you, Luke. So on this one, Salah, given your background, I'd like to start with you again. The question is, what is the data life cycle from design to operation within smart environments?
Thank you, Marta. So that kind of brings us to the digital building life cycle and how data accumulates from planning to design to digital construction and then to owner operations. And it's all about ensuring that the data is democratized so that whoever is making decisions, whoever is creating something or trying to build something, that they have access to the same source of truth as the rest of the team. And that way, people no longer have to second guess or try to create the data that they need based on the historical project that they have delivered. But it's all about creating the data in a way that it is accessible on a smart environment, on an integrated cloud platform, and that way when the data is interoperable or transferable, if we want it to be exchangeable between software and hardware, people can choose which tools they want to be using as long as they can consume the data and rely on the data that they are basing their decisions on. Back to you.
Thank you, Salah. I'd like to ask if Brian or Luke have anything to add to this.
Brian, do you have anything? I don't think I've got enough in my background to address it.
I do not. I think Salah covered that question very well. So I don't have anything to add, Marta or Luke. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. So next one, very much anchored in today's reality. How will smart building technology be used as companies reopen after COVID-19? Luke, please be the first one to answer this question.
Well, I think there's a number of ways that most likely we'll see a reemergence of the U.S. economy and the workforce get back into play. Time will tell as to how and exactly when we do that, but technology is going to play a big part. It already does because everyone is requested to be at home to push down the curve, to eliminate the curve, and to try to stem the pandemic. So with that said, I know that Google and Apple, and you've read the news, are looking for tracing and monitoring techniques. All of these things are going to need robust connectivity. And from a platform perspective, you can look at the ocean and you can look at an island. So I think from an island perspective, that's the Wi-Fi component for connectivity. But as we all know and are all challenged with, when we get on an island, typically we need an access code. If you're within the ocean of cellular, you've already established your account, you're already connected, and you have the widest availability of connection. So how, when, and where all these things come into play, how the medical field and the health departments incorporate into technology in a wider presence than what we've ever seen and known before, will come into play. But I think it's our duty as owners and operators of real estate to have that technology available so that those workers, once they're cleared with the green light, they come back to work. If, when, and where there's technology that can support that and augment that to make it a more robust office environment. If we don't have that, it would be like returning workers to an office without water, without sewer, gas, electricity. It renders that property pretty unusable. So don't find yourselves isolated without that technology. So Marta, that would be my inclusion of feedback.
Thank you, Luke. Next, I'd like to ask Sala, what is your perspective on this?
And thank you, Marta. My perspective here is that real estate owners and also the end users have to have a dialogue about what needs to be measured from the work environments going forward, and then applying the right type of sensors to verify that what are the abnormalities or what is the total performance of our indoor environment, and that way we can drive the tenant improvements, retrofits, renovations forward based on the evidence and the data that we can collect from our indoor environment. And when we need to make maybe material changes or structural changes, we start to integrate more smart technology into the environment to make sure that when we are monitoring the environment that we are measuring the right subjects, and that way we are constantly being proactive and predictive about what is happening in the environment before something actually happens. So overall, if we want to discuss a few examples, there is already a technology that enables us to use voice commands or hand gestures to interact with the environment in a digital format. I think that technology is transferable into our built environment. So it's just a matter of now boosting the innovation and seeing what is already off the shelf for some other applications and bringing them into our smart environment. Back to you, Marta. Thank you.
Thank you, Sala. Brian, anything you would want to add?
Yeah, I think in the midst of what we're all dealing with now, it's going to have an effect on, depending upon your role in a given company or what you do, it's going to have an effect on how you carry out your job in the future. And specifically, I think in terms of smart buildings, the impact to a network and that planning is going to be with, I think we're going to usher in an era of even more video conferencing, more remote working than what we've had in the past. And even within the building, that if we think about being more mobile than even what we currently are, then video conferencing and having a robust AV solution that can support very high bandwidth applications is going to be key, as I think we're going to develop. I know in my personal life, developing the habit of actually using video more. Could have used it in the past. Now you're just kind of forced to do so, to be able to take advantage of having a personal interaction that's better as we're kind of locked down. And I think as this opens back up and we get back to a normal, I think that normal is going to be new, and I think it's going to usher in a higher usage of video across our networks than what we've seen in the past.
Thank you, Brian. And let's continue with you, please, for this question. How can we make existing buildings smarter?
Yeah, sure. This is a good one, and it is challenging, because if you look across different types of structures, different types of buildings, depending upon the age of the building, depending upon the historical relevance of a building, this can be difficult because of pathways and spaces. And it can be also very difficult to repurpose older infrastructure because it's not up to date with what you actually want to do, as we've talked about in many cases already today with new wireless technologies and new cellular and more usage of video. So repurposing old infrastructure may not be an option. Pathways may not be large enough to add additional infrastructure, so it may be the case of using the old infrastructure as a pull string for new infrastructure. And we look at this in terms of the ability to collapse and capitalize on convergence and have less, be able to operate with less infrastructure, but it requires a change in the media type. So switching over to a single mode fiber that can combine all of this, and then putting that into a pathway that's very, very small, but yet takes up less space than what the old infrastructure took up. So that's a couple of things about thinking about how we repurpose the old infrastructure within, old pathways and spaces to be able to do the things that we want to do that's has a higher bandwidth or higher technological requirement. And then there's also the use of wireless. In some cases, like a historical building, adding a pathway may not be an option, but the ideas behind bringing in wireless technologies to be able to get across various spaces is also an option within a building. I think Sala has some additional comments on this as well.
Thank you. Maybe I'll elaborate a little bit. Thank you. Pulling from my background when I was doing structural engineering for retrofit and renovation projects, those projects were always an opportunity for installing new technology into the environment. But considering that we also have legacy buildings that don't allow us to make drastic changes or add anything into the environment for aesthetical reasons, etc., but maybe it's an opportunity for us to make the end users smarter, because everyone has a lot of technology that we carry with us when we go to places, and create a mesh with what we already have with us. Or we could expand the scope beyond the individual smart building and take the smart city approach or smart neighborhood approach and see how we could create a mesh and a network of smart environments together to elevate everyone and elevate also those legacy buildings that might not have the capacity to input all the technology that is required for modern or more future-proofed smart spaces. But definitely leaning in with what previous talker said, that whenever we are making structural changes, then that's when the upgrades need to be done, and we just have to be very smart about when we sequence those bigger upgrades into our environment so that we can deliver the smart technology as well. Back to you.
Thank you, Brian and Sala. Luke, anything you would like to add?
I think you've done a great job covering it, Marta. I would just add that I think developers and real estate operators are going to start changing their perception when they prioritize and budget their real estate. Older real estate will have to become a priority in the architectural and the builder budget that says practicality over high profile. In the past, developers have loved to put the marble in the lobbies, and they have loved to have great, terrific streetscape. I think they're going to have to say to themselves before they get to those components in the budget, and without eliminating technology as they typically do in the ninth hour, or put it into contingency or reserve, which eventually gets eaten up by cost overruns, that the priority of wireless and connectivity will have to be a common everyday staple in the budget, a minimum expectation that the appraiser will take into consideration under remodeling, under new construction, or the existing buildings that are difficult. Once you look at examining those and what to do with those buildings, the technology piece will now become the priority and not a nice to have. It will become a must to have. So I think I add that as an emphasis, Marta, and a highlight that people should start considering very seriously going forward. And I think this pandemic has only underscored the fact that technology, even in our residential lives, now has to be on the priority list and has to be properly budgeted.
Thank you, Luke. Here's the next question. What is missing in existing assessment and rating programs for smart buildings? Luke, I'd like to ask you to continue with the answering.
Thanks, Marta. You know, I think without T-Mobile's inclusion and participation in TIA's Smart Building Program, you know, I look at it very similarly for an assessment and a rating that I do when I go to a restaurant. I live in the Seattle metro area, and there are 4 different rating systems for restaurants, and they're posted at the front door as a requirement, as a notice to the public to tell them the expectations and for you to make a decision based on that notification. So I think we're approaching that type of a notification system. And I think we're also approaching a need that TIA and others are looking at to fulfill to make an assessment for a rating. When I approach a restaurant and it says excellent, I have that expectation that everything is going to be top drawer and excellent. If that excellent rating was equivalent to what is the technology in that space that I'm about to enter, it would be telling me that there's going to be most likely ample fiber, Ethernet, power, and conduit, maybe from a planning perspective. It will tell me that there's going to be Wi-Fi access, maybe on a guest level, maybe on a requested code level, and hopefully it would tell me that there's going to be continuity to my cellular carrier as I enter, where I'm not dropping out of the network, that I have continued connectivity with that cellular carrier, and the availability of any other technologies in the space. So I think, to me, this tells me that we're rapidly approaching that opportunity. I think the timing is right. I think now there's going to be a necessity for the society to understand where and when is there connectivity without discovering it on their own, or having a risk of discovering it on their own if, when, and where there is a peril. If they have to call 911, I think the last thing any of us would ever want is to see no service or requesting a code to connect to Wi-Fi to complete that call. Marta?
Thank you, Luke. Sala, your turn, please, to answer.
And thank you, Marta. I don't think that there is anything missing in the existing assessment and rating program, but now we have the opportunity to expand it to the end users of the program and the assessment rating system, and really start building up a continuous education program. And that way we can continue to refine what the assessment is and really draw from the industry what their critical needs are. And that way we bridge the end users and the developers of this assessment system together, and we can continue to kind of elevate the skill set and the knowledge of everyone. Back to you, Marta.
Thank you, Sala. And Brian, let's hear your perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with a little bit about why I think it's good for TIA to be leading this effort. I mean, if we go back to the formation of what we now know as the 568 standard and how TIA led in that to get us from networks that had different connectors and different cable types and get us to a vendor-independent, medium-independent standard, and how that drove the right infrastructure to be able to support whatever networking technologies are on the forefront and what's coming. But it not only did it for cabling, the standards affected the construction of the building itself. I mean, that's where, the inclusion of telecommunications closets were put into architecture. Before then, we were operating out of broom closets, and it wasn't a requirement to have that. That space is now there, and it's identified. So I think that it's good to see TIA taking on this initiative, and as Corning, we're so glad and honored to be a part of it and be able to lead in this area. What's going to be key is to not look at only the historical perspective. We've got to take a forward-looking approach to this, and it can't be confined or restricted by the way we've done things in the past. This is all about setting up an assessment for how a building needs to be built and constructed, and how technology needs to be integrated into that building to support all the things we talked about here today, not only today, but into the future. And so it's going to be important that assessment, that rating program includes things that are more forward-looking, much more so than they are rear-view mirror. Back to you, Marta.
Thank you, Brian. And with this, thank you to our presenters for the great perspectives and answers. At this point, we are going to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Let's give our presenters a minute to review the questions that have come in. And if we do not get to your questions, we will forward them to the presenters and they will get back to you directly. So again, we'll spend about 10 seconds for the presenters to sift through the questions. And look, once you have selected a question in the queue, please be the first to start answering.
Okay, Marta. Boy, we've gotten some really terrific questions this morning. A double-digit list here. I think the first question that I see, what can be done to end the cycle of rip and replace of infrastructure for existing buildings? I hope I highlighted that earlier. It's the proper provisioning with Ethernet and fiber. All of these are lower cost in mass deployment up front, and that obviously is plumbing your building for the future. So that's the first question that I see, Marta. Let me let you hand it off to Sala or to Brian as I kind of scan. We're well over 30 plus questions. Wow, this is terrific.
Sure, thank you, Luke.
Yeah, Luke, I'll jump in, Marta, just to jump in on that question there about how do we end the rip and replace cycles. We touched on that a little bit, and I think that a lot of it is in taking a look at what, again, back to what I was saying earlier about how we access and use networks is differently, and it's not as much about point to point as it is, you know, for one user. So not about my connection at my desktop. It's more about, you know, our connection, how we as a group of, you know, maybe 20, 30 users are connecting to a point up in the ceiling instead of just a single cable for everyone. And so I think in that rip and replace cycles, take that into account and then add in as we look at all of the different, you know, as we've gone through the categories of cabling, and it's always been able to keep up with the next networking technology, being able to transition and taking a real consideration of, I think I want to transition my network to an all-fiber single-mode infrastructure, because that is enough to support, you know, it's basically unlimited bandwidth there. So you've got enough to support not only convergence, but as you look forward to other technologies, whether it's, you know, your next generations or the next 3 generations of Wi-Fi or our next G. So what's the best way to be prepared for 5G? Well, one of those is have fiber in the building, because that's an infrastructure that can completely handle the requirements for 5G and the next G, and on it goes. So I think that ending that rip and replace cycle is moving to a media type from a cabling perspective. It's really got an unlimited pipe out there to the edge, and we can look back and know that, all right, I'm ready for whatever's coming as I move to a single mode fiber. That also answers another question that was in the queue for, are we talking about multi-mode or single mode fiber, and which one is best? Back to you, Marta.
Thank you, Brian. And from here on, I'd like to ask the 3 presenters, as you go through the questions, please feel free to answer them. So, for example, Sala, do you have anything you'd like to answer at this point?
Thank you, Marta. I saw a question about legacy buildings that were historical buildings. I already lost it on the list. We have so many great questions here. But I found that it was very interesting for me as an architect to think about how we might upgrade historical buildings to provide the smart environment that the end users are expecting. And that way, if we have the right type of connectivity and access to the cloud, then we can start building the digital layer of the physical environment for people to have more enhanced experiences in those environments. Thinking about museums and having the capability of applying like extended reality layer to the experiences, people might be able to learn more about the history of the building or the artifacts that are placed into the physical environment, and that way we can elevate the knowledge transfer and education of people who are arriving into our smart environments and also the historical environments. Unfortunately, I can't find the question on the list, but I just found it very interesting that it is something to start considering when real estate owners are thinking about what type of buildings they are applying and adding into their portfolio, so that it's a mix of different layers of history and not only focusing on what are the new buildings that we are developing into the smart city environment.
Thank you, Sala. Luke, is there any other question you have selected that you may want to answer?
Well, I saw one that said, what's the basis of the claim for 50% of the tenants will pay more? I think if you're a tenant today, your expectations of moving into a space that is the most capable space for your employees and your workers, for your vendors, for your visitors, is afforded in two different opportunities. You as a tenant have an opportunity to pay more in a lease rate amortized over that term, or you can get tenant improvement allowance from the developer, which is also incorporated into your lease rate, or last but not least, you can come out of pocket, which most companies do. They come in and personalize or customize the space. So I think that statistic is actually underrated. I think there's actually more tenants that would have an expectation of coming into a leased space, regardless of whether it's retail, commercial, hospitality, medical, your choice. Having that property prepared for that fourth or fifth utility would be a game changer, to have that work done ahead of time and not expecting the tenant to do that work. So, Marta, I'll hand it to you, and we'll continue looking at the questions.
Sure, thank you. Brian, anything you'd like to answer?
Yeah, there's a couple in here. I think that the two that caught my eye, in addition to what I answered earlier, is, are there any implications in data cabling as part of convergence? So I think we've already answered that to a certain degree as we talk, because it kind of ties back into the rip and replace cycles. But again, the idea of being able to drive multiple networks together and locate them in the ceiling together, so you can accommodate security and Wi-Fi and cellular all in the same area of the building up in the ceiling, and have that driven off of one single infrastructure. And I think that's the biggest aspect of the biggest implication of cabling as part of convergence, and what we see in some of the opportunities to take advantage of that. I don't know if Luke or Sala have anything to add to that question.
No, Brian, I think you nailed it from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. It was a good answer.
Marta, I see a question about how enterprise should think about monetizing their in-building wireless infrastructure. I think the cases are starting to emerge more than ever, but I think monetization might not be the only focus. I think there's cost efficiencies and cost avoidance that come into play. I think there's ways that I think in the future the developer property operator will receive benefit from, rather than just trying to monetize it to receive additional income from the tenant. I think there's always that capability or option to monetize it against the tenant. But you've got to be conscious for the fact that if building A down the block is not monetizing something as a premium to the tenant, that you risk losing that tenant. So at the end of the day, the developers and property operators have to focus on their tenant's experience. We try to do that at T-Mobile. I think Corning and Microsoft also do that. Focus on the experience and make that experience the best experience possible, if, when, and where you can attach cost savings, cost avoidance, or monetizing that. That will come into play, but I would say that is secondary. Marta?
Thank you, Luke. Sala, anything caught your attention?
Yeah, I'm looking at this percentage of cost savings that a building owner can expect, and that's a really interesting question And I would kind of expand it to the cost savings of the end users as well, that if everyone kind of thinks about their daily workflows and how much we use digital technology to enable fast decision making and faster processes and overall just more agile ways of working, if we think about the fact that if we didn't have great connectivity, we would have to be on more tedious manual processes and thinking about building maintenance, etc. Someone told me that it takes roughly 3 visits to exchange a light bulb. So if we didn't have bidirectional smart networks in our building and smart environments, we would continue to repeat the tedious manual process that actually just consume a lot of hours and time, but don't necessarily bring any added value to the end users or the maintenance people or the real estate owners. So if we think about the hourly rates and how much people use on specific jobs, considering either the operations or the maintenance or the end users, that's where the value of smart environments come to play, and we should be comparing those together, that there might be a cost for installing the smart systems, but there is the added value and the worth that comes from having the smart environment, because then we can start to automate more of the processes that we execute every day.
Thank you, Sala. To continue the round robin, I'd like to ask Brian, what is the next question you'd like to answer?
Yeah, thanks, Marta. There's a question here from a network designer talking about finding themselves at odds with other building design teams and how the focus always seems to be on the physical experience of the building rather than the intelligence of the building, and how can we move these folks forward on future technologies and design and support the future changes that will come. So I think that part of what we're doing now is bringing more recognition, more attention to the topic of what smart buildings and what it can enable is key. So education is big, and creating standards and assessment tools like we talked about is also big. And it's going to take some time as we try to make this impact in the industry. I think that one of the things that I'm encouraged by, and just speaking from Corning's perspective, is what we're seeing in certain aspects of the general contractors companies where they have creating integration teams that are now focusing on this. So to see this move into that space where there seems to be this more attention that's coming into the area that would say, A, I'm more interested in this, and B, I'm wanting to plan much earlier than what was being done prior. So it is one of those things that's going to take some more time, but we're starting to see the shift. And then finally, I think that a lot of what's going to drive it is just the pure demand that comes out of how much we depend upon networks. So we think about what we're doing on networks. It's much more than just surfing the web and checking email. When we think about being able to enable things such as telemedicine and things that are actually life-changing innovations, will also bring it to the forefront of we have to plan for this. It's a great question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you, Brian. And we're getting close to the top of the hour. I'd like to ask Luke and Sala if you want to take one more question each, and then we'll close this webinar.
Okay. I see a really good question about the drone access and what drones mean for smart environments and smart buildings. Drones, they are the vessel for putting a payload on. Drones are robots, basically, that can move more freely and execute more processes and workflows than a robot might be able to do. But what drones deliver for the smart buildings is that putting a sensor or reality capture device or anything that is a usable payload into the drone, you can make the drone go into places that you as a person might not have access to. It might be that the the environment that you're using a drone in is dangerous, or it's more confined than where a human being might fit, or it might be that there are some indoor air quality issues that it's not healthy for someone to enter the space, etc. So using drones for delivering a sensor technology somewhere that you don't have a physically statically installed sensor in, it gives you more freedom to access different locations and capture data from a much bigger area than you would by using the sensors that are already integrated into the physical environment.
Thank you, Sala. Luke, do you want to take one last question, please? I'm not sure if Luke can hear us. All right, so then this is all the time we had, and it's time to close. I'd like to thank our presenters for the great perspectives and answers, and thank you to all of you for attending our webinar. Over the next few days, we will be issuing Dixie CEC certificates to attendees of the live webinar. If you watch the webinar on demand, then please email to sbinfo@tiaonline.org the BrightTalk certificate that confirms that you watched the webinar. You also need to take the knowledge quiz in the attachment section. A copy of this presentation is posted on our BrightTalk channel, and we encourage you to visit and check for future webinars. And with that, again, thank you very much, and we wish you a great day.